So today's session, state and federal HFC regulations. I don't think there's a session that's happened so far where this hasn't come up. So today we're going to look at an overview of two active rulemakings that are going on in two separate states, one in Washington and one in New York, as well as an update from the EPA. So I'm pleased to welcome our presenters today. And I didn't even think about it that we're actually a panel of women today. Suzanne Hagell, Chief of GHG Mitigation in the Office of Climate Change for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Janée Zakoren, Climate Change Outreach and Engagement Specialist with Washington State Department of Ecology. Linda Kildahl, Air Quality Planner for Washington State Department of Ecology. Erin Birgfeld, Acting Branch Chief, Alternatives and Emissions Reduction Branch, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and Keilly Witman, Chief Governance Officer for the NASRC Board of Directors. And so I'm going to hand things over to Suzanne to get us started here.
Can you hear me and can you see me? Okay, good. All right. I am going to use the privilege of being the first person to go this morning to give an effusive thanks to NASRC for being an incredible resource for us in New York and working together for some years now. And this is the third time that we've worked on an event together, and just obviously filling a really important gap that we have in New York State for engaging with this industry. And I wish there was an NASRC for every sector that we work in, because it's just been such a fruitful relationship. And I wanted to say too, I think with NASRC, what I've learned over the years is that you're here for the environment and you're here for the industry. You're not saying that this transition is impossible, and you're not saying that it's easy. We're here to solve a really hard problem together, and I trust the information that we get from you. And so I just want to thank you again for such an excellent event. I think this week has been great. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the problem, is kind of shaping up in New York, which is a little bit different. But I also want to kind of share a general theme that I think every state is a little bit different. And every state has different retailers. Every state has a different workforce. So I don't think it's unusual for a state to be different. And I'm wondering if some of the themes, even if you don't work in New York, there may be some things that are relevant, to your state, even if it's different. So there, by my last count, about 24 states that have greenhouse gas reduction targets, either through legislation or through executive orders. In 2019, we joined the 16 states that have these in actual, codified statute. So the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the Climate Act in New York, has a lot of pieces to it, but there's specifically to the greenhouse gas point, which I think is most relevant here. We have two reduction requirements, which is to reduce emissions 40% by 2030 compared to 1990, and 85 by 50 compared to 2050. And then we have a goal in the law to achieve net zero emissions. I think when looking at how this may be relevant to other states that you may work in, there have been kind of trends over time that may be helpful if you're going to try to project what may happen going forward. I think we all started with targets like 80 by 50, and then some states said, well, what if it was 2045? Well, no, we're going to make ours 85 by 50. There's kind of this increasing level of ambition that you see state legislatures and executive branches pick up. Some states came in and said, I want to have a target in the interim, so maybe 2030. Some said, well, we're going to do 2020, and some did, a bigger target for 2030. So you do see some slight differences between the states and some slow, increasing in ambition. And I think the newest trends are adding a net zero goal to these targets. I think there are about 11 states now that have an actual legislation, so an actual statute committing to net zero by some date. And I think the other thing that's changing is what do these targets mean? So what's included within them? How do you do the math? Because what sources you include, what gases you include, and how you prioritize those things really translates to how you're planning on getting there. What are the policies? What are the priorities? And for New York, there were a lot of new things that were added in our law. One of them being the 20-year global warming potential. So when all of you see global warming potential numbers, there's a specific reference that's referring to, and it's in terms of a 100-year impact of those gases. The legislature and the grassroots organizations that really worked on the law in New York were really concerned about shorter lived gases like methane and HFCs. So they made a requirement in our law that we use a 20-year global warming potential. One thing I didn't put up on this slide is another trend I'm seeing, and I think is very relevant for our priorities in New York, is an increasing incorporation of what our law calls disadvantaged communities. So the actions that we take are also going to be prioritized based on whether or not they take place within communities like environmental justice communities, low-income communities, but also any other kind of community that's specifically vulnerable to climate change. And in New York, that includes rural communities as well as urban communities. I put a link down at the bottom, or the climate.ny.gov is where you can go to read more about the law. We had a draft scoping plan. It was out for comment for like 6 months. And we got about 30,000 comments, including some comments on food stores. And we are now incorporating that into, suggested recommendations that are going in front of the council that will provide the final report by the end of the year. So I think watch this space and see what else gets incorporated into the final plan. Now, putting HFCs into context, again, I mentioned our law. There's various pieces in the law when you dig into it. And when we try to implement the law through regulations on how to do the accounting for that law, how to do the math, there are lots of pieces that end up really intensifying the view that we have on short-lived climate pollutants like methane and HFCs. And I know you guys are primarily interested in HFC, so I'm going to focus on that. Anyone that works in greenhouse gases, if you're out there in the audience today, you could see the y-axis here. 400 million metric tons is a really high number, but it's because we're using the 20-year global warming potential and because we include a lot more sources than maybe other states do, including sources outside of our jurisdiction. The dark blue, though, is the thing I wanted to show you. So there was no dark blue in 1990, right? We didn't have an HFC emission issue then. In 2019, it's roughly 10% of emissions. As we look forward, the strategy the state's going to take is to replace fossil fuels in many sectors with electrification, electric cars, heat pumps. We're expecting a large increase in the adoption of equipment that could potentially contain HFCs. So as you go forward, we have these different colors: transportation, it's supposed to be transportation, buildings, electricity, waste, and agriculture and stuff like that. Those need to get squeezed into these kind of hash lines. So by 2030, it has to be a 40% reduction from 1990. These need to squish in there. And then by 2050, if we project forward the growth of heat pumps along with the growth of HFC use for other reasons, it's taking up half of the allowable budget. So all those transportation emissions, all that other stuff needs to squeeze into that remaining box. And so this is the challenge. How do we reduce HFC emissions so we have a budget left for all the other things that are necessary in our economy? How do we support building electrification while reducing HFCs? So here's where we are now. We, New York, Washington, California, formed the Climate Alliance, after the Paris Agreement. The HFCs were an item that we picked up right away, thanks to California. Followed along, wrote a model rule. Now we've got over a dozen states with either legislation or regulations or both, backstopping EPA's great work on rules 20 and 21. So that's done. That's on the books. Challenge is enforcing it now, but we have that. As many of you know, that was like a first step for retail refrigeration for HFCs, initial step down. Our next step is, reviewing what's going on in California, what's going on in Washington, keeping up with our colleagues in the U.S. Climate Alliance, while also trying to collect information on what's appropriate for New York. What's the retail food landscape like in New York? Do some of the policies and programs that other states are looking at or that are being done at the federal level, will those help us in New York? I put out a request for feedback in the summer. That's still on our website, and I'd still love feedback, and we're still getting some feedback, where we kind of put out a whole laundry list. I think Danielle even mentioned that in the opening for the summit, that New York kind of put out all options, and we want to hear from folks still on what to do there so we could develop a really good proposal. We're not just looking at regulations either. It's not usual for my unit, but we're also looking at building up incentives and demonstration projects. We got money in the state budget for NASRC to do a demonstration project for us in a disadvantaged community, and we want to use that to design new incentive programs, looking at California, looking at Massachusetts, for example, that you heard about earlier this week, as also, opportunities for learning what might be good for New York. I mentioned this a little bit. So the key considerations that we have that are kind of unique to New York, but I don't know if they're going to be picked up, by legislatures in other states over time, or that they may be of other reasons why they're of interest to folks, which is, our law uses the GWP 20. I'll show you a table in a second. Danny asked me to dig into this a little bit. It's very high for 448, 449. So those don't do a lot of good for us in achieving our targets. Natural refrigerants are absolutely like the best option. And I don't know why we would want any other option, honestly, to meet our targets. They're available now. They're absolutely future-proof. I'm going to talk about why someone who works in climate change would support people using CO2 in a second here. Some ideas that we threw out there, though, to negotiate this issue. Obviously, this is a communication problem. If people are used to a GWP, that's one number, and we're throwing out some different numbers, and we have to do that because of our legal requirements. What are some other options in regulatory text? I'll show you those. Like, could we look at composition? Should we refer to refrigerants by name? There's some things that we put in our request for feedback. I'm still happy to get feedback on that. Ultimately, because of the level of ambition that's needed, and if you've been watching the news this week, the UN reminded us again that everything that we've committed to is still not enough to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. So we know these are not just arbitrary targets that we're committed to. We really do need to achieve significant emission reductions across the whole economy. In this sector, having, work in dairies, we work in agriculture, we work in forestry, we work in waste, we work in electricity, we work in transportation. I look across these sectors. I honestly, commercial refrigeration is one of the most fun to work on because it's one that to me is really hopeful. Like there's a solution. It's really hard, but it's there. Like it's possible. We can work on this. That's not the case in every sector. So our objective really for this sector is to eliminate emissions because I think there's the potential to do that. How do we do that though? And some of the ideas that we've heard in the HFC space in general is, can we extend timelines and bank more on our ability to reduce leakage? That's obviously pretty risky from an emissions side, but it's something that we're listening to and trying to think through. A question that I'm going to have for you today, and I hope we can get to it, and looking at our next slide, which is looking at 20-year global warming potentials, is there a way to help you avoid investing in expensive temporary solutions? Is there a way to help leapfrog to these future-proof natural refrigerant solutions rather than wasting money on a strategy that ultimately doesn't help New York State? This is a table that's actually in the request for feedback. So if you go to our website, you can find a document with this table. If folks want to link to that, happy to share that. I know Danny and Morgan have it. So some of our friends over here from R22 down through, the initial phase of replacements to 448, 449, some of the lower GWP items that are coming in, maybe not necessarily for, the large systems, but for other uses. And then all the way down to your HFO, propane, CO2, and ammonia. The standard 100-year GWP is, of course, what folks are used to. That came from a IPCC report from 2007. Our numbers are 20-year, but they're also from a more recent IPCC report, actually from 2013. There's one, there's been an update since then in 2021. You're going to see these numbers go up, basically, because not only is the science getting better, but concentrations in the atmosphere are getting greater, which means some of these gases, their impact is also getting greater. The difference why 100-year and 20-year are different, and the impact for policy is that when you focus on a shorter time interval, you're focusing on the gases that have a shorter lifespan, because those gases have that much more of an impact over that short period of time. I like to think about, all greenhouse gases affect climate change. And because of the concentrations that we have and the growing concentrations, we are going to get extreme sea level rise in Manhattan. 6 to 10 feet is what we have in regulation as a projection right now. Short-lived climate pollutants, if we could get them out of the mix, we're pushing back when that happens. We're affecting near-term climate impacts, and that's really valuable. I mentioned one of the things that we propose is present composition as a way to look at HFCs and avoid confusion around the global warming potential value. Happy to hear people's thoughts so far. They've been pretty much negative on that idea. And then the last thing here, I just wanted to put out the social cost. If you're not familiar with that, it's used a lot at the federal level in regulatory documents. For example, we're now using it per the law in New York State. And I feel like it's a really useful way to set global warming potential aside and think about how these different refrigerants compare to each other. I did a little bit of math, if you can see on the screen here, just to pick on 407 for a second here. Listening to some of the talks earlier this week, thinking about the size of the systems, I saw examples where it's 400 pounds, 3,000 pounds, so some number in between there. If you were to release 100% of your 1,000-pound charge of 407, the cost to society, according to these federal models, would be a little over $100,000 of damages to global society. And for CO2, it's $50. So yes, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It's absolutely the main greenhouse gas, but the scale of the damage from HFC is that much greater. Again, it has nothing to do with the 20-year GWP, 100-year GWP. This is the model damage to society, to our economy, to the environment, to public health from these pollutants. It's about equivalent to that CO2 I put here too, just so you know, that's about equivalent to burning 50 gallons of gas in a 22 per gallon passenger vehicle. So very minimal. It's still a big deal.
Suzanne, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
The audio is just acting a little funny.
Oh, sorry.
There.
Is it good enough for now? I'm almost done too.
Yeah. Okay. Go for it.
So if you continue to lose, and maybe you lost that amount of CO2 every year for 50 years, the cost to society is still $2,000. So I just wanted to point out, yes, CO2 is a greenhouse gas, but it's, compared to HFCs, this is still a really great solution. And I apologize for the audio. I hope you can hear me well enough. This is the last slide. Again, I put out a request for feedback. If you want to review that, that's great. We're still taking feedback. Getting through everything out there. We use some modeling that was done as part of our scoping plan to highlight some options. So they're here. Since my audio is not working, I'll just come back to this if there are questions later. If you do have questions, you can reach out to me through my contact here on the Summit site or through our climate.regs in the box. Thanks.
Thanks very much,
Suzanne.
Suzanne,
Oh.
and welcome everybody. Keilly Witman here. For everyone else, we did have a request for the GWP chart that Suzanne showed. whether we could provide a link to that, so you can find that link actually in the chat area, not in the Q&A area. We're trying to filter everything through the Q&A area, but you have to go to the chat for that. So thank you for providing that. In terms of the questions that we received, actually, I think one of them is actually about federal. It's asking about a comparison of the AMAC to the Kigali amendment. So if you're all right with that, we'll leave that for Erin, who's actually from the EPA on the federal side. I think that's more appropriate for her to address. And then we have a question in general about incentives. And honestly, I think probably incentives is something that's going to come up across everybody. So we'll maybe save that question until the end and let everybody respond to that. What I did, just maybe some clarifying questions. I know many of the people that are attending here, they're experts and they know some of the terms that you used, but just in case there's anybody, you talked about now having a net zero goal. Can you just briefly explain what net zero actually means?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I may go back. I find it helpful when talking about those terms to look at charts like this. This is not net. These are all emissions only. This is a bar chart. Everything's above zero, right? A net goal would be that there's an equal amount. You know, this amount here in 2050, it's about 60 million metric tons. We need 60 million metric tons then of emission removals to be driven by our policy as well. That would be net zero. So we have 19 million acres of forest. They provide about 30 million metric tons right now every year. So the more we could do with the forests, you know, many states are looking at, particularly California, looking at other artificial means for capturing carbon and storing it. So that's what net zero would be. Either we find a way to pull 60 million metric tons out of the atmosphere in 2050, or we need to emit less than 60 million metric tons to be net zero.
Okay, so basically several ways to achieve net zero. Either you stop emitting everything completely, which then equals zero emissions, or you, in layman's terms, you manufacture energy and save CO2 emissions, and your emissions you make versus the emissions you're removing equals zero.
Right.
So, okay, all right. And you did have a slide where you said that you backstop SNAP rules 20 and 21. I think lay people out there, they don't memorize the names of SNAP rules by heart.
Yeah.
Can you just basically explain very briefly what that means? What went into effect when you actually backstop SNAP rules 20 and 21?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like it's like a time capsule. You go back to the SNAP program 2014, 2015, the status of the prohibitions that and I don't want to speak for EPA, but that EPA had gotten to at that point regarding you can or cannot use these substitutes in certain types of equipment. There was a fear about losing that consistency, that clarity, all the work that folks put into working with EPA on that rule. So the states backstopped it, meaning either they adopted legislation or regulations to make those prohibitions enact within the state. So anything at that level within the SNAP program, which was basically, if I'm understanding correctly, the first incorporation of HFCs into those listing and delisting decisions. We wanted to make sure those were protected. So that's what those rules all look very similar, because we worked on a model rule together to be consistent.
Okay. And one more question, just something. So many of us were recently at a big conference just a couple weeks ago, and there was a big presentation by a couple of the people who manufacture refrigerants, and they were talking about a lot of the new refrigerants that they were bringing out on the market. and about, the fact that they would come in under the 150 global warming potential metric that many of the states and potentially the federal government might use. And actually, I asked the question and I said, what happens to these GWP values that you're showing? Do these new refrigerants actually come under a 150 global warming potential in the state of New York if you use the 20-year global warming potentials? And instead of answering the question, which was a clear yes or no question, they explained about 15 minutes about how they're still arguing with the government of New York and all of you to try to get you to change the 20-year GWPs. If I understood you correctly, that is written into the law, into your mandate. So there is no changing that. That's fact. That's not going to change. Okay.
Yeah, and I think an important piece to that, and I apologize if we haven't communicated this. The act uses 20 years. So all of our planning to achieve the requirements as a state agency, all of our modeling is going to be in 20 years. But on top of that, right now, the way the law is written right now, it says any regulation promulgated to achieve those.
Sorry, Suzanne, do you want to try maybe turning off your video and seeing if that helps with the video? No, I'm sorry. It just got a lot worse. If you don't mind signing off and coming back on.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, sorry.
No problem. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, and then we'll go ahead and we'll move on to the next presentation.
And sorry, yeah, there we go. Okay. We'll just leave you all in suspense on the answer to that question, which I think we all know the answer to, but when she comes back. Thanks, Keilly.
All right, so now I think we're moving on to the state of Washington.
That's right. So Janée and Linda.
I think you're muted.
Okay, can y'all see that?
Yeah, we can see and we can hear you now.
Outstanding. Let me just move some things here. All righty. Well, good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Janée Zakoren, and I am the Climate Change Community Outreach and Engagement Specialist for the Climate Policy section here at the Department of Ecology. With me today is Linda Kildahl. She is our rulemaking lead on Washington's hydrofluorocarbon rule. And we're excited to be here and share with you where we are in the rulemaking process and what we have left to accomplish still. But before we dive in, I would like to take a moment to thank NASRC for hosting the summit and for putting together a great program this week. There is nothing more inspiring than hearing from subject matter experts and the incredible work that they're doing. I would also like to take a moment to introduce the amazing team of people that are working on the HFC rule here in Washington. Now, although they are not presenting today, they are on the call. We have Leonard Maku, the HFC unit supervisor, Linda Kildahl, our rulemaking lead, who you'll get to meet in just a moment. Tamara Dumitrescu is our HFC technical expert. And last but certainly not least, we also have Keilly Brink, our greenhouse gas reductions specialist. To start with today, I'm going to briefly touch on the law in Washington and what progress that we have made thus far. So in August of 2021, we did begin rulemaking to implement portions of Washington's 2021 HFC law. Now, that law did expand our state's HFC oversight, which had been based on the SNAP-like rule that we adopted in 2020. The 2021 HFC law did authorize Ecology to adopt maximum GWP thresholds for new commercial refrigeration and air conditioning equipment. The law also required Ecology to establish a refrigerant management program to address leaks in existing large refrigeration and air conditioning equipment. Additionally, it required that the labeling options under our 2020 SNAP-like rule is expanded. And then finally, the law did establish a prohibition on the sale and purchase of small cans of high GWP refrigerants here in Washington. And that prohibition became effective in July of 2021. As you can see, Washington's law does cover more than just commercial refrigeration alone. So that brings me to where we are in terms of progress. Well, thus far, we've held 5 stakeholder meetings, and we have our next one coming up on November 17th. We have shared draft rule language on the GWP thresholds for new equipment and new labeling options under our SNAP-like requirements. And more recently, we've shifted gears slightly and are now focusing on the Refrigerant Management Program, or the RMP, as we'll call it. I'm now going to hand things over to Linda, and she will briefly go through the 2 main prongs of our rulemaking, as I just described. So she'll cover the GWP thresholds and the RMP, and then she'll discuss what issues we are currently working through now. So take it away, Linda.
Thanks, Janée. Go to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so as you heard, our law is quite specific in certain areas, and this can be helpful in some ways and less helpful in other ways. So I want to say, as I open, that our goal is to meet the objectives of our law while talking and working with industry to understand its possible impacts so that we can chart a path forward that is lands nicely in the middle. So with respect to the GWP thresholds for new equipment, we intend to use the values referenced in our law. Those values are 750 GWP for new air conditioning equipment and 150 GWP for new refrigeration. Although there are some exceptions that we plan to have some higher thresholds for particular equipment based on available technology and the necessary approvals, which is something that we must consider for each category of equipment. Some of the issues that we are encountering as we're working to set these thresholds and the effective dates is not surprisingly issues that we've been hearing a lot about during these past sessions, which is the tie to the adoption of updated safety standards, and the tie to the appropriate effective dates for our new thresholds. Actually, our law specifically does tie the date of the thresholds to adoption of those standards. So we have to have those in place and then wait 24 months before our thresholds can become effective. Another issue we've encountering also heard this week, the complexity of transitioning complex supermarket systems. On that, we continue to talk with industry. We've got a meeting coming up with NASRC. We're hoping to create a reasonable path that, and this would include having ambitious but realistic effective dates across all equipment categories and determining when existing equipment is modified such that it should be considered new and be subject to a GWP threshold. We note that California adopted a company-wide weighted average approach to address this concern. And I will say we explored that option and have so far determined that we don't have authority under our law to establish that type of framework, but we do have flexibility in where we set the effective dates and how we define new equipment. And we are definitely interested in hearing industry feedback on those particularly those 2 issues. Other issues include labeling and reporting requirements, which we know we will be putting in place, and also a process for variances. And with that, I'll go to the next slide, Janée. With respect to the RMP, as Janée stated earlier, our law does require that we adopt an RMP for both refrigeration and air conditioning systems that use 50 or more pounds of a high GWP refrigerant or an ODS in a single circuit. For equipment that uses a low GWP refrigerant, that being less than 150, registration and participation in the program is not required. And then next slide, Janée. The main components of our future RMP look very much like those in California. You can see them here. They include registration, leak inspections, leak repair, reporting, and record keeping. But there are a few notable differences. First one, our initial thoughts for equipment size categories are different than California's, as you can see in the top right corner of the slide. Also, our RMP will include air conditioning in addition to refrigeration. And finally, our law requires that we set a leak rate threshold that achieves greater emission reductions than EPA and that reflects a superior achievable performance under EPA's Green Shield program. So our law has set a fairly high bar. Next slide. Some of the remaining considerations, because we are just starting this RMP portion of our rulemaking, but what we're encountering now, let's say with respect to ALD, we will be seeking industry, and I should say automatic leak detection. We will be seeking industry feedback on this very issue at our November 17th stakeholder meeting. So I encourage everyone who can to participate in that meeting. Another item, the last item, consistency with other state and federal programs. This is a big one for us, considering that EPA is moving forward with their RMP rulemaking. And obviously we will be following that very closely. For right now, I can say that our law requires the establishment of an RMP, and we intend to keep moving forward. The law also requires that we evaluate our RMP every 5 years to be sure that it is still meeting its objective and to determine if the program is still needed, given the transition to refrigerant alternatives that is already happening that we've heard a lot about this week. And finally, considering what EPA does in the months ahead. Again, I want to note that you can see draft rule language and a table of the initial draft RMP requirements with a lot more detail on our HFC rulemaking page. And with that, I will turn it back over to Janée to go over our timeline, future activities, and how you can participate.
Great, thank you. So with a captive audience, I'm going to make one more plug for our next stakeholder meeting coming up on November 17th. So if you haven't written that on your calendars yet, now is as good of time as any. Now on this slide, we have laid out our rulemaking timeline that we are currently on. And the first two boxes that are outlined in yellow are where we are now in the process. Now that yellow box, now is the time that we are looking for feedback from our stakeholders on draft rule language. And this does include the RMP table that is on our website. We have several ways for stakeholders to provide feedback, which I will cover in the coming slides. But the most important thing to know is that we really want to hear from our stakeholders during this informal comment period. As discussed in the previous slides, we have a lot to cover still, and we do rely on that input from our stakeholders to help guide the rule development. We are looking to have a couple more stakeholder meetings between now and February 2023. And following the timeline, you can see that we are looking to conduct the economic analysis in late spring, early summer, and then are aiming to propose in July of next year. And as it's laid out, we would expect to see rule adoption by the end of next year and beginning of January 2024. And once that rule is effective, the RMP will be in place. And however, we know that there's a lot of parts and pieces, and we want this to be a successful launch of the program. So in the next year, we're going to be working on a lot of outreach. We'll be working to engage stakeholders so that they're informed and aware of the program and what requirements are under the RMP. And we will also know that there's going to be a data system that will require user trainings for our stakeholders. And to help with this, we'll be working to create guidance documents to help make the program easy for stakeholders to navigate the reporting platform. And we also do anticipate hosting some training webinars for that reporting platform. Once the program is launched, our team will be working to ensure that our users have the technical assistance they need to successfully use that program. And then lastly, I also want to share that in the development phase of our reporting system, we will be offering opportunities to participate in data system user testing and provide feedback on the development of those guidance materials. Now, I previously mentioned that I would cover opportunities to participate and provide feedback during this informal comment period. Again, we have a lot of material to cover during this rulemaking, so the earlier you provide your feedback is the better it is for us. So now you might be wondering, how do you do that? Well, first of all, attend stakeholder meetings. Again, our next one is November 17th at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And well, how do you get that link? You can use the QR code that is on this slide that will take you directly to our HFC rulemaking page. You can also just Google HFC Ecology rulemaking, that will work too. And then on that rulemaking page, you'll have access to explore many things. This includes reviewing all the materials from previous stakeholder meetings in case you haven't been able to attend those. That includes recordings and draft rule language. And you can also register for our next stakeholder meeting on that webpage. Additionally, on this page, you can provide feedback directly to us using the e-comments feature, a very convenient way for you. And then you can also scroll to the bottom of the page where you can then sign up for the email list so that you get the most up-to-date information on Washington's HFC rulemaking and stakeholder meetings. And then lastly, you can also find our contact information to reach out to us directly on that same website. So I cannot stress it enough that we want to hear from you. We're giving you all the opportunities that we know how to engage with us, so please take advantage of that. And we also have our direct contact information on this slide here that you can contact our technical expert or any of those individuals that are listed here, whatever works best for you. And with that, we thank you so much for your time and inviting us to present today, and we look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thanks so much. That was great. I really appreciate how much effort many people in the state government are making to try to make this as easily understandable as possible. And I commend you. It was a very clear presentation. A couple of things. Would you be able to pull that link? I know you put the QR code, but I don't know how fast people are with their cameras on their phones, quickly taking a picture. Could you pull that link out and maybe put it in the chat? And then, because also that's a lot to type in as quickly as you can, and you just have to get one digit wrong and you wind up someplace you really don't want to be. If you could just put that in the chat, then people can just click that on and then bookmark the page. Because I do think that many people in government underestimate how hard it is for regular people to understand how to participate. And if you have to choose one thing to participate in, this goes to the audience out there. If you do business in the state of Washington, I would prioritize participating in their process, because from what I can see, there are a lot of things that if you don't participate in, you are going to have some pretty big problems. And there's the potential for some pretty big unintended consequences. So just very, very specifically, one thing that I'm quite concerned about is your definition of new equipment, because what I've seen so far, my fear is that your definition of new equipment is going to lead people to resisting making any upgrades to their current systems for fear of triggering that definition of new equipment. And we've already seen, for instance, even with like coal-fired power plants, the EPA many, many decades ago passed something like that. And what we got was very, very dirty coal-fired power plants, because they refused to make any upgrades to anything, because then it would trigger this whole very burdensome bunch of EPA regulations. So it actually had the unintended consequence of making many, many things worse. So we really need to participate in this and help get a sensible definition of new equipment. But perhaps could you just explain the different things you're considering in terms of how to define new equipment?
Yeah, certainly I can take that. And it's a good one that you commented on, because as I mentioned, it's one of the things we're working on right now. The definition of new, I think that you're seeing is from our current rule, that's in place now, and it is a definition. Well, we're working to add a new definition of new in our new rule. And I think what we've heard so far when we shared the original definition with stakeholders in a previous meeting was they wanted more specificity on, obviously we're talking about retrofits, right? Because if it's new, it's pretty easy, it's new, but there's retrofits and when they become new. We've heard concerns that the way to calculate when it becomes new, the 50% of the capital cost of replacing the equipment is hard to know when you've crossed that threshold, hard to know what to consider in that threshold. So we're working now to get a lot more specificity, trying to get rid of that language and make it more in terms that folks will understand. What percentage of your compressors, what percentage of your condensers. And so that's one way we're trying to get more specificity. With regard to your comment on it might delay future a transition. The only thing I can think of, and this might not address it, but we noticed that California had a 3-year window for that replacement to happen in order to be considered new. And we're thinking of not having that 3-year window. In case your concern is like, oh, they can play that 3-year window, they can stage their retrofits so that they don't have all of it in 3 years. So we're working on getting rid of that. So those are the things that spring to my mind at first, the ways that we're tackling what we have heard are concerns, and maybe there's more out there.
Okay, so just for everybody in the audience, so terminology. So in the refrigerant world, retrofit has a very, very specific meaning. It just specifically applies to situations where you're sucking out the old refrigerant and replacing new refrigerant. And I think the issue of what characterizes new equipment has more to do with upgrades during remodels. And, for instance, situations where you take 20 old cases and replace them with 10 new cases that are more energy efficient. If that were to trigger the definition of a new system, people will just avoid changing out old, energy hog cases for, new ones. And that would be very unfortunate. But we can talk more about it online, but it's not a question. Certainly you can do system changes during refrigerant retrofits, but supermarkets are changing their systems all the time out there. So let's just take the action item, and I'm willing to get involved in this however we need to. And perhaps the NASRC would be a great forum. I'm on the policy team for the NASRC. I think maybe, and this is what we did in California, we got a group of end users together to try to sit together with government and come up with a definition that doesn't prohibit desirable advances, because of the terms of the regulation. And I know end users are willing to do that. It's difficult to do that meaningfully when you're just providing written comments because there's no dialogue, right? There's no opportunity for you to ask questions and then them to respond to it. So I think what we really need is a dialogue.
Very much agreed, and very, very welcome too. We would love to meet with you.
Okay.
I just want to note really quickly that we do have a meeting scheduled, and that if there's retailers, we've been sharing the information in our monthly retailer roundtable, and we have a couple of retailers that have confirmed to participate in, start the conversation. And like you said, Keilly, it's really hard to ask questions and get information when you're just responding to a written communication. So the idea of this meeting is to open up the conversation, get at, what data would be needed, what would be helpful for the state of Washington and considering an alternative definition. So I encourage any retailers that are on the line who want to participate in that meeting to reach out to us or reach out to the DOE team.
And again, a shameless plug, come
Sorry.
to our stakeholder meetings.
And come to
That's
the-
another way to purchase. It's an easy way. I know
Sorry.
schedules don't always
Yeah.
align, but definitely that's a very good way to come and kind of see what we're, you know, that broad spectrum. And we try to post all of our our draft language ahead of the meetings, but so people can review them and know kind of what we're thinking. But yes, all of the things. However, like I said, contact us. We want to talk. We want to hear from y'all.
Yeah, and I should have said that too. We'll post that meeting on our website here. And those meetings
Great.
have been great, sharing information. The thing that's sometimes helpful with retailers when there's maybe sensitive information that needs to be shared is we find a smaller group that we can ensure is just, you know, retailers only. They know each other. They know who's on the line. It's a little bit easier to talk and share information. So, but those meetings are great.
Yeah. And also, I think, so having worked in government for many, many years, I was told over and over again, you know, how, because I was not on the regulatory side, and I was told over and over again how reluctant the regulated community is to speak directly to a government that is eventually going to be enforcing against them, right? There is this fear that, you know, especially there is this fear that if they say something critical, that.
Oh, your audio is a little bit muted. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you, Keilly.
So,
Keilly, maybe if you disconnect and rejoin, it'll reset your audio.
okay, all right. You still can't hear me?
Oh,
No, you're
nope,
good
you're
now.
good now.
Okay. All I did was mute myself and then unmute myself. So I don't know. You know, there's this fear that, you know, anything you say can and will be held against you, you know, 5 years down the road when it comes time for enforcement. So people do feel in general much more comfortable going through a kind of neutral organization. I don't want to discourage anyone to reach out directly, because I can, through direct experience, say the people who write the regulations and the policy are often not, at least in the context of the EPA, they're not the same people that go after you for enforcement. There's very little, you know, gossiping about, you know, negative things people said that happens in those contexts. So you should not be afraid. But in any case, let me ask you this one. Would you guys consider, let's say that through the EPA's AIM Act, through the Kigali Amendment, you know, through the SNAP program, through changes to Section 608, something like that, you know, if the EPA starts changing things that, and you find them to be favorable changes, would you consider aligning with the EPA once they release those details?
The answer to that is absolutely. I mean, we've heard stakeholders want that, and of course it makes sense. We understand that. It would depend upon what came out, right? But our goal is to align with with other states and with federal regulations in these areas. So we would, keeping in mind that our statute, our law is quite specific, but we're very willing to work and to, you know, help. If there's creative ways to do it, we're willing to do that. So the answer is yes.
Okay.
The one thing I would mention is, you know, it couldn't be if the EPA's was somehow was viewed more relaxed than ours, that would be a bigger conversation. That might be a little trickier, but still, we do want to align where we can.
That
Sorry,
makes
I
sense.
cut somebody off.
I think keep in mind, there is already quite a lot that is similar, right? If you saw that slide there, they're talking about leak rate thresholds. They're talking about mandatory inspections. They're talking about a lot of the same things that are required in, you know, even in the current Section 608. And, you know, they're talking about GWP thresholds. They're talking about, regulating which refrigerants you're allowed to use in which end use, right? That corresponds quite well with the way that the SNAP program works. So, you know, there is, let's put it, I think it could be a lot worse, right? Nobody is talking here about things that that the regulated community has never heard of before, at least yet. So, I think the rest of the things here, we'll come back after the EPA. Will maybe come back. There are some things we missed with New York, because of the technical difficulty. I'm going to leave some of those questions.
Sorry, your audio is fading again. So we're just going to hand things over to Erin now to give us an update on the EPA federal regulations.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. As I am multitasking and how's that? Can you see me and hear me?
We can see you and hear you, but not your slides yet. If you'll just hit the share screen button.
All right. There we go. How's that?
Great.
Good?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here today. You'll note that in the intro, you noticed that I was an acting chief, an acting branch chief, and have been in this role since May. So I really want to thank you and Morgan for kind of reaching out and you know, us having that initial connection as I came on to sort of bring me in particular into this community. And I can see from this meeting and from this kind of wonderful event, you know, the value that NASRC really brings to this effort. So for today, I really want to give you an update on our regulatory actions under the AIM Act. And of course, those are very aligned with a lot of what we've already heard today. So I think what I'll do, because I know we want to make sure that we have enough room for questions and discussions, I'm going to go through some of these slides pretty quickly. But if anyone has questions and wants me to go back, I'd be happy to do that. As many of you know, EPA was given authority in 2021 under the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act to do three major things. One, set a phase down for HFCs, production and import. Number two, set regulations that would limit use of high GWP HFCs through rulemaking. We're calling that our technology transitions rule. And of course, you guys have already heard that that's very connected to the quote unquote SNAP 20 and 21 rules when SNAP made decisions to disallow certain HFCs for particular uses. And then finally, a big topic of conversation today and an area where we have some new information is subsection H of the AIM Act, where we're thinking more about management of regulated substances, very akin to the RMP program that you heard from Washington State. In addition, I'll give a very brief overview of what's going on in our SNAP program. For those of you who don't know, the SNAP program is simply under Title VI of the Clean Air Act, where we were phasing out ozone depleting substances, and that part lists alternatives that are appropriate for use in certain end uses. And then again, I do hope to leave quite a bit of time for questions and discussions. So I've been told you all have seen this many times. So this all just goes to say that, and I think my colleagues at the state level have put this beautifully, these HFCs really matter. They're incredibly powerful. 0 point up to 0.5 degrees C is a huge impact on the environment globally. And so this work in managing refrigerants, reducing emissions and refrigerants, and phasing out of HFCs is really critical to getting where we need to be on climate. I think I essentially just went through what we have on this slide, but it really, again, just reinforcing sort of the three legs of the AIM Act. So phase down sector-based transitions to alternative technologies, and then really looking at refrigerant management, HFC management, reclamation, and leak reduction through subpart H. So here we have the phase down schedule that is under the AIM Act. You'll notice that we have a very big drop in 2024, 40% as compared to baseline. You know, that's a very big threshold. And what I've heard from probably many of you in the audience, but you know, and in other meetings, is that we can do this, and it's going to be tough. And here at EPA, we're really running to make sure that we can support that in as many ways as we can. Kind of aligned to this, I'm sure you all have spoken about this earlier in your briefing. You know, last night we got a nice little tweet from the President Biden noting that he did sign the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which is great, and just in time for the international meeting where the parties to the Montreal Protocol meet, which is next week. And this puts us in alignment with other countries that have signed on. And to answer the question that was raised earlier, what's the difference between AIM and Kigali, and how should you be thinking about those two things together? I think the best way to think about it is that the AIM Act really gives us all the tools we need, and maybe a little more actually, to really fulfill our requirements under the Kigali Amendment internationally. And the benefit of joining out Kigali through the Montreal Protocol, of course, is that now we're a part of this international community that is all working together to fully phase down these HFCs globally, and not just in one country. So I'm just going to do a quick kind of run through of, again, that three-legged stool process. I'll note that Keilly made some really good points about kind of the rulemaking process and kind of where it's important to engage. One thing I'll just highlight that is that if you're not intimately familiar with the federal rulemaking process, there are certain times where we can very easily have public engagement and meet with stakeholders, and then certain time when it's a little bit more restricted. So pre-proposal, before we put a proposed rule out on the street for comment, is a great time to engage with EPA, talk with us, have meetings. We are very interested in your feedback at all times, but especially at that times as we're developing the proposal. Once the proposal goes out, where it's a little bit more formal, and we're asking for your written comments, we'll have a formal hearing, et cetera, and then we'll go final. And this process is set up essentially really to keep it very organized. And one thing that we will never do at EPA is tell you what we're thinking of doing before we actually officially put it out on the street as a proposal, because that will just be confusing and is kind of counter to sort of the being true to our process. So just want to make sure that, you know, if you ask me questions about what are you doing and why are you doing it, and what do you prepare to do on any of these rulemakings, I'm happy to answer as much as I can, but there are certain things that until it's final, we don't want to, we're really just not able to give you those details. So hopefully that context is helpful. So here we had, this is the first allocation framework rule, really set forth the phase down of the HFCs. That was finalized last year and set out a framework for how that would happen. This year we put out, I think I'm going to skip this one too. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. And so just kind of leaning into the framework rule a little bit more, the final rule set out the framework, which again also includes enforcement and compliance mechanisms. And again, this is really looking at mostly chemical manufacturers and importers of the bulk refrigerant. We also, in continuing to implement the phase down, again, that's phasing down import and production of the bulk refrigerant and the bulk HFCs themselves. We just issued a proposed rule issuing allocations for 2024 and beyond, and there's a 45-day comment period. It has not yet published in the Federal Register, but should be coming soon. And we're taking public comment on the methodology we're using to distribute allowances in 2024 and beyond. And again, just highlighting there's a big decrease in 2024 to consider. So here we're back into pre-proposal stage. So I mentioned before under the AIM Act, subsection I, we like to call it technology transitions. We are authorized to restrict fully or partially a regulated substance in a sector or subsector where the regulated substance is used. And then, of course, the AIM Act also provides for a petition process that allows the public to petition EPA for such a restriction. And this subsection also gives us a list of factors that we need to consider in determining whether to grant or deny a petition, and then also how to consider what the ultimate restriction should be. So this is a reprise of what we've seen last year. So we received a lot of petitions to restrict use of HFCs in refrigeration, air conditioning, heat pumps, foam, and aerosol sectors. The petitioners asking for these restrictions were NGOs, environmental groups, trade associations and industry, states, and private companies, many of you on this call. So we worked last October to grant, or in one case, partially grant the petitions. And we are currently working on a proposed rule that will take action on all of those petitions. And just a note, and those petitions are, of course, publicly available, and granting those petitions doesn't mean that we'll propose anything identical to what's been requested. So as I said, we're pre-proposal, so I can give you a little flavor of what you'll see coming and a little sense of timing. Our NPRM in the technology transitions rule will cover about 40 subsectors, 40 applications in refrigeration, air conditioning, heat pump sectors, foam, and aerosol. We plan to address all of the granted petitions in one rulemaking, and this rule will also kind of in the same establish some framework around how we plan to implement this rule moving forward. So I mentioned before that we have a pretty particular set of factors that we need to consider when we're considering the substitutes and making our determinations about the HFCs that are appropriate to use and the thresholds for restriction. You know, of course, we always use the best available data in our rulemakings, and we are looking at, in general, the availability of substitutes in the sectors and subsectors, and taking into account, to the extent practicable, all of these many points kind of in point B below. So is it technologically achievable? Are there commercial demands, safety, consumer costs, building codes, et cetera? So lots to consider and lots of sort of moving parts there. We're also asked to look at overall economic costs and environmental and historical trends. So this rulemaking will be proposed later this year. We'll have a public comment period. And I'll just tell you that the rule was delivered to OMB on August 26th. And typically OMB is asked to have a 90-day review period. So that gives you some sense of timing there. We do have a statutory deadline for issuing a final rule, which is 2 years after granting the petition. So in this case, that gets us to October 7th, 2023. So moving along to subsection H, which is management of regulated substances. Again, the AIM Act gives us the authority to maximize reclamation of HFCs. So that goes a little beyond refrigeration potentially, and minimize the release of regulated substances from equipment. It asks EPA to coordinate with similar regulations. Keilly has mentioned 608 and 609, for example, under the Clean Air Act. And subject to appropriation, we also have the opportunity to establish a grants program for small businesses for purchase of recycling, recovery, reclamation equipment. So we are also similar to my colleagues in Washington State. We're kind of launching a bigger effort to reach out to stakeholders, get information and make sure that we have the best information that we can have as we start developing this proposal. And to do that, we issued a draft report on this sort of the state of HFC reclamation as we see it, just on October 17th, excuse me. And we requested comments on the topics that are in the draft report. So again, kind of to highlight Keilly's point, this is where we really want to hear from folks in the stakeholder community about what's right about this report, what's not right, is there data missing, and even beyond that, to help us really understand kind of what's happening out there that can help inform these decisions to provide a proposal. We're asking specifically for questions and information about, what are the current reclamation processes, practice, and technology? How is the supply chain of, what's the supply chain? What are the costs? Some information or ideas about incentives for reclamation. What considerations are there regarding safety and consumers? And, I probably buried the lead here a little bit, but what are the barriers and challenges to reclamation, and thoughts and ideas of how to overcome those challenges are very welcome in those comments. Following on that, I think we just beat Washington State to the punch for the stakeholder meeting by a week. We have a virtual stakeholder meeting on November 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, I should say. And we, I think, already have over 300 participants signed up. And so we really look forward to that event and your participation. And here's a little link for where you can get more information and to register for the stakeholder meeting. And with that, I am cognizant that we may not have that much time. So I think unless Keilly, you would like me to go through the SNAP listings, I think I might skip that. Maybe Keilly's not back. Okay. Maybe I will just quickly go over that. We do have one SNAP rulemaking that's ongoing that connects to the latest versions of some of the UL standards. We proposed it in July, and we're covering some alternatives in sectors in refrigeration and air conditioning and fire suppression. Comment period closed in September, and so we're actively working on the final now. We do anticipate developing another rulemaking, SNAP Rule 26, that will list a lot of new refrigerants in the A2L and flammable categories as alternatives for a lot of the commercial refrigerants. And with that, I think I will leave it, and thank you very much for your attention and the invitation to come talk to you today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Erin. And Keilly, just checking if your audio is working now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Okay, good. Feel like I've turned on audio from about 6 sources, so now the danger is going to be that you'll hear an echo, but let's see if this works. Thanks very much, Erin. I appreciate it. I know it's a lot of information to to try to communicate, and in some of the areas, there's not a lot of specifics yet. So I'm going to start here with the last question first. And the question itself is, will the AIM Act phase down impact existing systems or only new systems? And where do upgrades fit in? I think this kind of demonstrates the mismatch in terms of kind of what the government is saying and what people are understanding, because the phase down regulates the supply of refrigerants, and then you kind of let the market, determine it. It's basically a restriction of the supply, and then, you're trying to get the prices of the refrigerants to go up so that you're encouraging people to be more responsible. But so, and I think people don't really get the difference between the state regulations, mostly are regulating refrigerants you can use, and the emissions. And the EPA's main vehicle is to regulate the supply of the refrigerants and to gradually tighten the supply. But they're asking whether it impacts existing systems or new systems. So maybe you can address that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really important distinction. I mean, the bread and butter, the basic of how this thing is going to work is with phasing down production of the chemical. So really focusing on the chemical, and that chemical is going to be phased down on a GWP basis, right? So the allocations are given, they'll be stepping down, and there'll be less and less and less HFCs available based on the GWP. So how high the GWP. So theoretically, under that system, given a free market, you're going to say, hey, I'm going to get out of the highest ones because they don't get me as far as the lower ones. So that, in terms of, so that's really where we need to be. And the AIM Act aligns us perfectly with the Kigali amendments and that phase down. So really, that's kind of, that is the foundation of everything. And then for this group, we're really thinking about, refrigeration, how am I going to manage my refrigerator, my supermarket, et cetera. So you're like a little step past the chemical producers, and sort of how does this availability of refrigerant, HFC refrigerant in particular, how is that going to impact me as a store owner, equipment manufacturer, et cetera. And so Keilly, I'll, please jump in and let me know if you hear me say anything that you think is off too. But so there will be less HFCs kind of moving forward through this phase down. So what does that mean? It means that refrigerant's going to get more expensive, and that reclaim refrigerant hopefully will become more available because it should be more valuable. Under AIM, we have two tools that are not the phase down, and Washington State and New York, we just heard about, they're limiting thresholds for GWP similar to what we're doing. There's, this great kind of synergy amongst their staff. There's, so you have all these great thought leaders, like kind of thinking about these things in similar ways, and we are too. And then we also have the reclaim. So those are the two tools that are not required by Kigali, but that, in the ozone depletion world, EPA recognized that we're incredibly valuable to kind of meeting the phase down of the ODS, the ozone depleting substances in refrigeration. And so those are included as additional tools to maybe take a little bit of the pressure out of, by setting thresholds in a way that's a little bit more organized. The market doesn't have to be quite as tight. And the HFCs can maybe flow to the areas where they really are needed, and there's no, good alternative available right away. Is that helpful?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, there's only so much refrigerant out there. Use it for new systems, use it for existing systems, up to you, right? But the general rule in phase outs has been, for God's sake, don't use it for new systems, because you can choose what refrigerant you use for new systems. And if you use, natural refrigerants in new systems, it leaves it leaves more refrigerant for people who are stuck with existing systems to use for repairs and things like that. So you should be making good choices in your new system so that we have more flexibility for the many people out there that are stuck with, you know, old systems that use some of these high GWP refrigerants. Because let's face it, even the new systems people are installing that use 448, 449, they are not low GWP refrigerants, right? They are included in this, you know, the phase outs that we're getting that are you know, go by metric ton based on GWP. So so they are going to be crunched also. So so that's just kind of a main message, right? You use the good stuff for new systems so that we're not squeezed so tight with your existing ones.
Right. And only one thing I just to add, I think through the ODS experience and you know, EPA has had a value of, you know, not requiring people to take out a system that's not done with its useful life. You know, there's like this idea that you don't want to waste something that's installed, and you know, so and I think that was an approach that worked for the ODS phase down, phase out, and so it's something that I think we can work. It's an experience that I think we valued and worked well. So.
Okay, and here's a very interesting question to me because, and I'm very glad that the person who posted this is listed here as guest. Will leak repairs be required again for HFCs and 50+ pound systems? So there's something called the venting prohibition, right? You're just not allowed to vent refrigerant at all unless it's one of the refrigerants that are exempt from Section 608, but it has always been illegal to vent refrigerants. But maybe you want to, I don't know how you want to answer that. Will leak repairs be required again for HFCs and 50+ pound systems?
That's right, and I think the other piece there is, I think yes, so venting is prohibited, absolutely. I do also think that, you know, that verbiage around in subsection H that talks about coordinating with other parts of the law, looking at Section 608 and making sure that it applies to HFCs under the AMAC and making that connection is absolutely something we're looking at to ensure that the leak repair pieces are also required, and again, that's something we're looking at for sure.
Okay, we have one here, and I'm not sure. So the first part of the question is, can you provide more details on the new proposal of the 2024 to 2028 allocation baseline? I thought it was the same baseline as in the rest of it. Did you propose a new baseline?
There were okay, so let me just clarify here that this is not the rule that I'm working on. and so I'm not going to be able to go super detailed, but I do know that there was adjustments to the baseline based on data that was sent in later, and so it is an adjusted baseline that we're looking at.
Okay, is it okay? So it's still the, well, like you said, you don't work on this area. I thought it was still the same date range, but they just got new data. It's not like you.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Completely different baseline. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And what about so this would be what about the incentives for the reclamation of refrigerants? It says, can you provide more detail on the incentives for reclamation of refrigerants?
Trying to get to my slides. So I think we wanted to understand in this on our report what incentives were. I'll say, you know, and actually maybe also understand if there are disincentives as well. So I think hearing from the industry regarding those issues would be particularly valuable to EPA, so we can kind of understand. I mean, I think, you know, again, I'm sort of speaking from what we've heard is that we want to increase, we've been asked to increase availability of reclaim. And what we hear are different things around the market, and maybe there are difficulties in the market that we might not fully understand. And so we want to really understand those so that we can really think about if there's a, you know, what types of solutions are available. Because I'll also say that, you know, not all solutions are solved with a regulation. So we're interested in looking at this issue kind of holistically as well, and considering if there are voluntary partnership type opportunities that can help in this space also.
Yeah, the idea of incentives there, I'm sure they mean monetary incentives. I'm not sure how that would work. I think the greatest incentive use reclaimed refrigerant. At some point in time, we're going to reach the point where your incentive is you'll be able to get it. You'll be able to get reclaimed refrigerant is going to be the main driver of that. But here we have an interesting one. In yesterday's Reducing Refrigerant Emissions webinar, Ed Esberg of Raleigh spoke about dramatically reducing refrigerant charge sizes. Is there a way to modify leak reduction requirements to recognize lower overall refrigerant emissions resulting from reduced charge sizes? So first thing I'd like to say, and as the person who launched and ran the Green Chill Partnership for 8 years, it's not universally agreed that lower charge sizes actually result in more refrigerant leaks. Right, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that lower charge sizes also result in lower pounds of refrigerant leaked. So let's just make sure that's clear. I know Ed believes that. Many other people do believe it, and there's evidence it's not true. And you know, you can kind of go both ways. It depends on a lot of other factors. But I'm not aware that anybody has an actual leak reduction requirement. The thresholds, many of people, and maybe the states want to get involved here, the thresholds that you're talking about in the threshold in Section 608 is once you reach that threshold, you must repair the leak. But there's no federal requirement saying you must reduce your leak rate to a particular leak rate, as far as I'm aware.
In Washington, that is the case, correct? It's not a compliance threshold. It just and so yes, they're not required to reduce leaks, to reduce the emissions.
Yeah,
of the leak rate.
And the EPA threshold is also once you reach the 20% threshold, which used to be 35, it's mandatory that you repair.
That's right. Again, this is not my particular area of expertise. I'll just share, but I believe is this the 2016 rulemaking that you're referring to? I think we changed some.
No, it's a general question about leak reduction requirements in conjunction with the fact that when you reduce the charge size of your system, it's you know, like if you leak 200 pounds and your system has 2,000 pounds, it gives you a 10% leak rate. If you leak 200 pounds and your charge size is 400 pounds, it gives you a 50% leak rate. So as supermarkets are trying to reduce the overall charge sizes, the amounts of refrigerant the systems contain, the one argument is that you automatically get higher leak rates. And then this person is referring to some kind of a leak reduction mandate, which I'm not aware of that exists. It's just a threshold. After you exceed that, you must repair your leaks.
Yeah, I mean, that threshold is a really interesting, the 50-pound threshold in terms of like what's in and what's out from those requirements, first of all, right? Is that, because I think, well, anyway, we're thinking about this in terms of also, you know, the history I've heard around that 50-pound charge threshold, not necessarily like how low do you need to go in the threshold, but the 50-pound threshold was very much around to not have to be in people's houses, you know, and requiring those types of, and really making it sure that it's particular commercial places where you're standing up refrigeration systems that are going to be that need to be maintained well. So I think that number was at the time, again, we're talking 6 Clean Air Act under ODS world kind of a while ago, that was a number that seemed to kind of separate those two types of uses fairly well. So anyway, that's sort of what I'm thinking about, but does that 50-pound charge size still like make that distinction? I'm not sure. We're living, you know, 20 some odd years later, if not more, so 30 years later. So that's, we'd be interested in information about that as well.
Okay, I think we're slowly but surely running out of time. We were going until 11:30. Is that correct, Danny?
Yeah, that's right. We are out of time. I know we have some more questions in the Q&A that we weren't able to get to. But I want to thank our presenters today and to you, Keilly, for moderating this session. And, you know, I think folks can feel free to reach out to the presenters directly. The contact information, I think, was included in all their slides. If not, we'll make sure it's there before we post it on the website. So thank you again to everybody.